Thank you for joining us today on this very warm early June afternoon. We're glad you're here. I know that insurance, we get a lot of questions, and so I'm really glad that you could make it. And we have Drew here to help guide us through this. So just as an introduction, I'm Tylen. I'm the membership manager here at MNA. I'm joined by my colleagues Shelby and Adam. And this meeting is being recorded, so we will ask that you all stay on mute. Unless you have a question, then please feel free to mute, but just so the folks watching the recording have the best viewing experience. If you have questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to put them in chat. If they're kind of like a time-sensitive question, we will let Drew know, and he can address it in the moment, and otherwise he will have time at the end to answer questions. And, I think from having talked to him previously, like your weird specific insurance question that kind of only relates to your mission, that's fine. We know that that's often the case with nonprofits is, it might not be widely applicable, but you still need the answer. So feel free to ask that. And anything that doesn't get covered, we can, make sure to follow up with you about. But today we are really glad to be joined by Drew Colwell. He's an insurance agent working for HD Insurance. They're part of WaFd Insurance Group, and he focuses exclusively on commercial property and casualty insurance. He moved to Montana from Idaho pretty recently as part of the opportunity to work remotely, which we were just talking about. And he brings with him over 5 years of experience working with nonprofits. WaFd Insurance Group insures more nonprofits in Idaho and Washington than any other agency in either state. And so we're really excited to have Drew in Montana, able to focus a lot on nonprofits. And so he attended the University of Montana, and then he went back to Idaho where he was born and raised. And he started working with his father, who's been in the insurance industry for over 30 years. But of course, as we all are, he's excited to be in Montana and to help nonprofits with insurance needs. He's been great. I'll just say, working with him myself, I appreciate how responsive he is, and I'm excited for you all to be here and get to learn from him. So Drew, if you wanted to go ahead, as long as you're all set up, I will let you take it away.
Sounds great. Thanks, Tylen. Yeah, like Tylen said, I am a very new Montana resident. Just actually got my driver's license last week, so I'm just couldn't be more excited to be part of such a great state and such a great community. In my research, looking for nonprofit organizations to work with, learning more about the nonprofit sector here in Montana, I was really surprised to see that even though Montana has about half the population of Idaho, there's almost if not more nonprofits here in Montana than we have in Idaho. And so that's just great. I love seeing a thriving, vibrant nonprofit community. And just a brief backstory about how I ended up working with nonprofits. It's really just because, like Tylen said, I started working with my father, who had been doing insurance for over 30 years. And he just kind of fell into the niche of working with nonprofits because one called him about 20 years ago, just basically at the point of frustration because they just could not find adequate representation from an insurance agent. And so then he, realized, as I realized when I started working with nonprofits, is there's just really not many insurance agents that specialize in nonprofit insurance. You got a bunch of insurance agents that like working with people in construction or plumbers or electricians or manufacturers, but not many people focus on nonprofits. And so, being able to help people who help others, it's a very rewarding thing to do, and that's why I continue to do it, and I'm really excited to start doing it here in Montana. And so with that, we'll get started. So I just wanted to start off with a brief overview of insurance. One thing I've learned working with nonprofits is that many people who found nonprofits or find their way into an executive director position or director of finance position, they may have no prior experience or knowledge when it comes to commercial insurance. So I always like to start with the education and then talk specifics later on. So we'll start with some brief education here. And insurance, it really provides a measurable and predictable value. And what that means is that, whether you realize it or not, but the amount of employees you have, the amount of business personal property you have, the type of services you provide, the amount of clients you have, those are all measured. and the insurance carriers use that to predict, what kind of coverages you may need, or what your future likelihood of claims are, and things like that. And it also uses data and analytics to predict future claims. And so they're keeping, as any business does, they're looking very closely at the amount of money they bring in, but probably even closer at the amount of money that goes out, covering claims for their clients. And so they use all that aggregated data to predict future claims, and that's ultimately what impacts insurance rates. And I don't know how many of you, have had insurance for any time now for your organizations, but rates have been going up over the last few years. And it's just because insurance carriers are incurring more costs, and we're seeing more frequency of insurance claims coming in. And whether you realize it or not, the whole business model of insurance carriers is to spread the cost of claims between all their clients. So if they have a year where more clients than average have claims, that's when you're going to see your rates go up, even if you personally, your organization, didn't have any claims. And there's a really wide variety of insurance policies that are available both to businesses and nonprofit organizations and us as individuals. And so we'll go over in the next few slides some of the common coverages that aren't really unique to nonprofits, but are still good to have some knowledge about. And then we'll talk about some of the more unique coverages for nonprofits. And each and every insurance policy is unique. It's one thing when you've got 100 retail shops in somewhere, like a little resort town, you've got all your boutique shops, all their insurance is pretty similar. It'll be a little different because there's different named insureds and different things like that. But when you put 100 nonprofits and compare them to each other, you're all providing such a diverse range of services that your policies are very unique from one another. And typically, more than one policy is going to be needed to adequately cover all the risks that your services, that your organization faces. And it really all fits together like a puzzle piece. And with that being said, you generally want to try to get as many of those policies from the same carrier as possible, not because in the commercial insurance world, you see things like multi-policy discounts, but just because when you can place all your business with one carrier, they have they should have a very good understanding of what you're doing and how to rate it. And you can develop a relationship, not just with your insurance agent, but by default with the insurance carrier as well. So some of the common policies that really we see for any business, any nonprofit organization, is we start with general liability insurance, and what it provides is it's simple. It's a claim of bodily injury or property damage, and it's not bodily injury or property damage to the nonprofit or to your employees. It's actually third party. So if someone comes into your facility and they hurt themselves, they trip and fall, that's a general liability claim. If you're doing a fundraiser at a local restaurant or a local brewery and it's damaged in some way, that's a general liability claim. And what's unique about general liability, it really follows you around. It's not tied to a specific location like a property policy, but anywhere within the coverage territory, which in most cases is going to be the United States and its territories. If a claim comes in, they're going to cover it. And so you could be at a conference somewhere in another part of the country. You could, have a base in Bozeman, but you might be providing some services out in Sydney. If there's a claim out there, it's going to be covered if it's a general liability claim. The next policy is an auto policy, and it's pretty self-explanatory. It provides automobile liability, but then it can also provide, the comprehensive coverage and the collision coverage if there's an accident and you want the organization's vehicle to be repaired. And then property insurance, it provides insurance both for real property as well as business personal property. When I say real property, that's like your buildings and things like that. And business personal property is more along the lines of, your desks, your computers, your telephone systems, things like that. Then workers' compensation, it's also fairly self-explanatory. It provides workers with medical benefits and medical payments and lost wages if they're hurt on the job. Now, some of the policies that there are some for-profit businesses that need these policies, but they're much more common between nonprofit organizations. So they are unique. And so I want to touch on those here, and I'll go into greater detail in the slides that follow. But directors and officers liability, it's a big one. We get a lot of questions about directors and officers liability, as I'm sure, Tylen and her colleagues at the Montana Nonprofit Association get lots of questions about that as well. And, it's a very critical insurance policy for any nonprofit, because by law, by mandate, each nonprofit has to have a board of directors. And the next one is abuse and molestation, and it's not a fun coverage to talk about, because those claims, they get messy really quick, and but it is something we see more of as we go on. There's organizations like the Boy Scouts who have been in the news plenty over the last few years for some of the stuff that has been alleged to happen within that organization. And then professional liability, it's a little less known, but it is for organizations that are typically providing services like counseling or medical services, financial services, coaching, and things like that, or any services that are required to carry a professional license. Like myself, I'm a licensed insurance agent, or a realtor. There's counselors need them, doctors need them, lawyers need them. So depending on what kind of services you provide, you may have some professional liability exposure. And then accident and health is really unique to nonprofits. I can't think of very many instances where a for-profit business would need an accident and health policy. What's really cool about it is it does provide reimbursement for medical costs for volunteers and for participants in special events. And I'll go into detail on that here in one of the next slides on why I think that's cool. So we'll talk more about directors and officers here. And these next few slides, you're going to see this first line, the first 4 words are provides a legal defense. That's because the most common claims for these types of coverages are lawsuits. 99.8 directors and officers policy claims come in the form of a lawsuit made against either an individual board member or the organization itself. And what's cool about the directors and officers policy is it doesn't just protect the organization, it protects the board of directors as a body, and it protects the individual board members as long as the suit is in relation to something they did while they were serving in their capacity as a board member. And it can protect their personal assets. And so that's a big one. If you have people on your board that have, it's not their first rodeo, they've been on several boards before, they hold, some kind of profession themselves, whether they're a law doctor or an attorney or someone like that, they're going to want their personal assets protected, and in most cases they're going to require that the organization they agree to be on the board of have a directors and officers policy in place. And one key area where a nonprofit D&O policy is different than, say, a publicly traded company or even a private company that has a board of directors is it can be used for inter-board conflicts. So let's say you have a couple board members who just can't see eye to eye on something. They both dig their heels in, and either one of them gets voted off the board, or they quit and turn around and sue the organization. Well, that can be a covered claim as well. And that's not the case for a publicly traded company or a private company with D&O insurance. And it provides a limit for damages, meaning that if you're sued and the claimant is awarded any kind of damages, that is what the insurance policy is designed to pay for. But it also includes the legal defense. So the carrier, it provides the attorney for you. They spend the time in court. Really all you have to do is provide them with the information they need to defend you. But as we all know, attorneys aren't cheap. They're very expensive. And so defense costs are generally outside the limits of liability on the D&O policy. And why that is so significant is because if the organization is sued and the carrier spends $500,000 defending the organization in court, if you have a $1 million directors and officers policy, you still have $1 million to be paid out in the form of damages if defense costs are outside the limit of liability. So, no matter how much the carrier spends on your defense, it doesn't eat into the limit that you have to pay for if you are found, to be acting illegally or in a breach of trust or in a breach of the duties or the bylaws or whatever the case may be. And that's critical. And it's something, if you do have a directors and officers policy in place today, I would really recommend getting in touch with your agent to ask if defense costs are outside the limit of liability or inside the limit of liability, because it's a big difference. Next is employment practices liability. And employment practices liability, it's another unique thing for nonprofit D&O policies. It's usually included in a directors and officers policy for nonprofit organizations. Now, again, that's not the case for private companies or for publicly traded companies. They're generally separate policies with separate premiums, generally written by separate insurance carriers. So the fact that they're included on the directors and officers policy is a huge benefit to nonprofit organizations. And instead of protecting the board of directors, which it can do, but it really protects the organizations again from claims made by employees. So if someone is let go and they allege that they were wrongfully terminated, that they were discriminated against, that they were harassed, or it was a hostile work environment, that is a typical employment practices liability claim. They're either going to sue the organization or they're going to go to the Department of Labor and file a complaint. And, coming from Idaho, which was a right to work state, this was still a very important coverage for nonprofits. We have seen several claims come in where the ex-employee or current employee was awarded pretty significant amounts of money. But now being here in Montana, where the employment laws so heavily favor employees over the employers, it's an even more crucial insurance policy for nonprofits. Because all it would really take is if you are hiring for an executive director and 20 people apply and you give one person the job, any of those other 19 people could say that it was because of their race, their gender, their sexual orientation, their religion, and that would lock you up in a suit. And again, it provides the legal defense for the organization as well as the damages if the claimant is found, if the judge awards the claimant any lost wages or potential future earnings or anything like that. So it's a very important coverage for nonprofits. And candidly, because they are on the same policy as a D&O policy, it's just one policy written by the same carrier. I can tell you that in the 5 years I've been doing this, I've written dozens, probably at this point close to hundreds of directors and officers policies. And in that time, I've seen less than 5 claims come in against the D&O policy and dozens of claims come in against the employment practices liability policy, because they are much, much more common. And part of that is that employees, and rightfully so, are realizing that they do have rights as an employee and their rights within the workplace. But another driving factor is social media. Someone loses their job, has a bad day at work, gets into it with their boss. A lot of people, they may go on Facebook and vent. And now that we're all so connected, someone could comment or reach out in a private message and say, why don't you file a complaint or sue them for discrimination or something like that. So we are seeing a significant rise in employment practices liability claims. So it's a very important coverage. Now we'll take a little bit of a deeper dive into abuse and molestation coverage. Again, it's not a fun coverage to talk about, but unfortunately, it's just a reality that a lot of nonprofits, they serve very vulnerable clientele, and oftentimes you'll see the type of people who engage in this behavior, they have a very predatory mindset. So they may seek out a position in employment or even as a volunteer for an organization that does serve vulnerable people. And it provides a legal defense for allegations made against the organization, employees, and volunteers of anything, whether it's abuse, molestation, unwanted advances, inappropriate conduct. And it's certainly something we recommend for organizations serving a vulnerable demographic, which some of you may do and some of you may not. So some of you might have a big need for this, whereas others might not. But any organization that works with children, the elderly, people with developmental or physical disabilities, people struggling with substance abuse, we insure one of the largest support nonprofits for victims of sexual and domestic abuse in Idaho. They have a very big need for it because, a lot of times when someone comes to a nonprofit like that, they are extremely vulnerable based on what they've just gone through. And so it's a really critical coverage to have. But not only is it a good idea to get the insurance coverage in place, but then you work either internally or with your insurance agent or a risk management professional to come up with really sound practices and procedures surrounding how allegations of abuse are handled. So anyone that may receive an allegation knows who to report it to and what that process looks like. But then also a procedure that outlines, or a policy that outlines, how interactions between clients or volunteers and staff should happen. Are we going to let, our staff or volunteers meet up with our clients outside of business hours in a non-controlled location? And so it's really good to have those kinds of policies and procedures set in stone, to have that be part of the onboarding process, not just for employees, but also for volunteers, and then have a screening process so that as you're hiring people, or if you're getting a volunteer who might work directly with your vulnerable clients, you probably want to run a background check on them, not just within the state of Montana, but probably a nationwide background check, just to see what their past looks like. Do a Google search. I can't tell you how many stories I've heard about people or organizations or even businesses that have hired someone that, if they would have just done a quick Google search, would have found out that that person had done some pretty terrible things, earlier in their life, that could have prevented something terrible from happening during their time with that organization. Now, professional liability, it's a little narrower how many organizations might need professional liability, but really what it provides is a legal defense for claims made against the organization, employees, and volunteers. And it's recommended for organizations who employ licensed professionals or are providing professional services. So a low-income medical clinic, a counseling organization that does work with people who are either veterans who suffer from PTSD, or people who have gone through domestic or physical abuse, people who have been victims of sexual trafficking, any kind of services like that. Or let's say you're a financial coach for low-income individuals. Or you are, say, doing vocational training for people getting out of prison or refugees or something like that. There's a chance you may have some professional liability. And in the for-profit world, the type of people who need professional liability are people like me, where a mistake I make could cause someone a significant financial loss. And that's the case for some nonprofits. But then you could also have, inadequate treatment, inadequate services provided, and things like that are a little more unique to nonprofits. And it can protect the employees as well as the organization. If you do have licensed professionals in your organization, like a doctor or a counselor or a lawyer or like a CPA or someone like that providing services to outside clients, you probably want to put a procedure in place that requires them to have their own professional liability, or what we refer to as errors and omissions insurance, or in the medical field, it's medical malpractice insurance. But that alone generally isn't good enough, because their personal policies likely aren't going to protect the organization as a whole. And so that's really the main benefit of the professional liability, is if the organization itself is named in a claim related to professional liability, it provides that legal defense. Now, I talked about the accident and health earlier, and we'll dive into it here. Like I said, it provides the medical payments for volunteers and participants in special events. Volunteers are ineligible for workers' compensation because they're not compensated by your organization. There have been instances where someone has gotten hurt. I think one of them was a volunteer for Susan B. Komen Race for the Cure. They showed up to volunteer that one day. They got a T-shirt, and while they were there, they hurt themselves significantly. So they hired an attorney, arguing that the Susan B. Komen's workers' compensation policy should cover it, because that T-shirt was compensation. She was compensated for her time with that T-shirt. And so there are some tricky ways that people can try to argue that volunteers should be covered, but generally speaking, they're not going to be covered on a workers' compensation policy. But if they get hurt while they're helping you serve your mission, in a lot of people's eyes, I would think that it might be prudent, or a good volunteer retention strategy, to get an accident and health policy in place, so that they know that if they're hurt giving their time to you, it's not going to cause them a large out-of-pocket cost. But it would also depend on the policy type. Some accident and health policies are primary, meaning regardless of whether that individual has their own personal health insurance or health insurance from their employer, it's going to pay no matter what. And some of them are secondary, meaning that if there are costs that their individual health insurance policy doesn't pick up, then this policy would pick those up. So in addition to organizations with volunteers doing some kind of labor, or they're on the street doing fundraising, doing outreach, awareness, things like that. But if you have a camp, if you have some kind of special event where there might be a 5K walk or a marathon or some kind of athletic activity, it'll also cover the participants of those activities so that if they're hurt, they can get those same benefits. And it kind of acts as a safety net for the general liability policy, where if you can prevent claims from hitting that general liability policy, you're better off in the long run because your cost for that policy won't go up as much. That policy is generally much more expensive than an accident and health policy, depending on how many people you want covered on this. And so it can function in a few different ways. Now, I mentioned automobile liability earlier as a common coverage between both businesses and nonprofit organizations, but what's a little more common for nonprofits than a for-profit business is employees and volunteers driving their personal vehicles on behalf of the organization. So you've got an executive director, you've got an events coordinator, a marketing manager, an outreach coordinator, whatever they may be. If they're driving their personal vehicle to do their job, the organization, it does have some automobile liability, because if they get into an accident and they're at fault, and let's say that their personal policy, it's not sufficient, it doesn't provide enough liability to pay for the damage or the injuries that they've caused, that the organization's probably going to be named in a lawsuit related to that incident. And so really, any organization that has employees or volunteers using their personal vehicles, it's a good thing to consider. It's really inexpensive compared to a traditional auto policy or a commercial auto policy. It's depending on how many people you have doing this, it's probably going to be around or even less than $500 a year. Can also provide liability for rented vehicles if you do travel for your role in your nonprofit organization, or you're renting vehicles to provide your services. It can provide the liability and physical damage coverage for the rented vehicles. And if you do have an employee or volunteer that gets into an accident, you might think that their personal policy is going to cover the organization, but that's not what it's designed to do. Most personal policies, they exclude the commercial use of vehicles on that personal policy. And so it'll probably pick up your employees or your volunteers' liability and pay for their medical costs, pay to repair their car. But what it's not going to do is defend the organization. And there's another area where it's a good idea to develop, and this one's not comprehensive at all, unlike the abuse and molestation guidelines and policies and procedures. But if you do know that there are employees using their personal vehicles, either once or twice a year, just ask them for a copy of their insurance card that either they'll pull up on their phone or have in their glove box, just to make sure that they do have insurance coverage. Because if they don't, then the organization absorbs all of the liability for the lawsuit or for the accident. Now, liquor liability, it's not necessarily unique, but the need that nonprofits have is unique. You're not a restaurant serving alcohol, you're not a liquor store, you're not a distillery, you're not a bar, but many of you may have annual galas or dinners or fundraising events where alcohol is sold. We all know that alcohol can be a great lubricant for, reducing the friction, pulling the wallet out of their back pocket or pulling the checkbook out of their purse, to help generate some donations. And so a lot of nonprofits, they incorporate the sale of alcohol, or even, into their annual galas or their events. You may even have, I know in Boise anyway, it was very common for nonprofits to partner up with local breweries and go there for the night and raise awareness. And then the brewery gives the nonprofit a kickback of the profits for the night. And, let's say someone shows up at a gala or a fundraiser like that and has a few too many and gets in their car, and on the way home, they get into an accident. Not only is liquor liability on the entity that served the alcohol, but they were really there, as part of the fundraiser for your nonprofit. And so if the accident is significant enough and the attorney is good at what they do, they're going to name the organization in a lawsuit. And that's what liquor liability provides, is defense in that exact kind of lawsuit. And regardless of if you were, you or your volunteers or employees were serving the alcohol, or a third party caterer or vendor was there serving the alcohol, this policy will respond. Now, cyber liability, again, it's not necessarily unique to nonprofit organizations, but again, the need is. Not many for-profit businesses have a donate now button on their website, but a lot of nonprofit organizations do. And that's not the only thing that a cyber liability policy would provide coverage for. These cyber criminals are getting extremely creative in the ways that they are trying to earn money illegally. But if your organization suffers some kind of a breach, or your systems are compromised, or you're targeted by cyber criminals, there's actually federally and state specific mandates, federal mandates and state specific mandates, that dictate how entities who house PII, personally identifiable information, have a duty to respond. The first thing you have to do is you have to notify every single person whose data may have been compromised, that a breach has occurred and that their data may have been compromised. Then you have to provide them with free credit monitoring for a year. Then you have to pay for and participate in a forensic investigation to determine how this breach happened. That's the mandated, there's really no getting out of that. And then depending on the type of information you store and the type of protections you put in place to prevent it from being hacked, there could be fines, especially if you're housing any kind of medical data and didn't take the necessary steps to safeguard it. And in addition to those mandated costs, if you do have a breach, you probably want to do some PR once you get a handle on things, to let people know that, yes, this happened, it was unfortunate, but we took steps X, Y, and Z to prevent it from happening again. PR costs would be included on a cyber liability policy. Then you might want to look at enhancing your network security. Maybe, it was a little lacking before, especially now that we have so many people working remotely, working from home on their own networks. There can be coverage provided to enhance the network security. And that's just a really brief overview of the coverages available for cyber liability. A couple other ones that I want to hit on. One of them, because it happened to me specifically, is called social engineering fraud. One morning, I got into work. It's about 10 minutes after getting to work. I got an email from my boss, my dad at the time. And the email said, "Hey, are you available?" And I replied, "Yes, I'm available." And then he replied saying, "Well, I need you to send this amount of money to this person. Let me know when you're ready and I'll give you the account number." And on Microsoft Outlook, it said, coming from Doug Colwell. And so I kind of started to work on this and just thought it through and said, this is weird. Like, we're insurance agents. We're not wiring money to people. This just does not seem normal. I'm going to give him a call and see what's up. So I called him and he said, "I don't know what you're talking about, but you should probably stop." And that is exactly what social engineering fraud is. It's if someone trying to, social engineer you out of your money. So anyone with an email address, you're vulnerable to a cyber attack. Telecommunications fraud is the exact same thing, but over the phone. As things like cryptocurrency become much more popular and talked about, there are hackers who will hack into your system and turn every single one of your machines into a Bitcoin miner, and that can be covered. Not only it'll cover, shutting down the network so that you can do the repairs, but it'll also replace all of the computers that were compromised. And so, the list goes on and on. Cyber liability has gotten extremely comprehensive. It's still relatively affordable for what it is providing. And, it's certainly worth thinking about and talking over with the board of directors if you don't have a cyber liability policy in place. Now, ERISA and fiduciary liability, for those that don't know, anyone that has a 401k plan or a similar type of retirement plan, it is ERISA compliant, or should be ERISA compliant, and ERISA bonds are required to bond the funds in the ERISA compliant retirement plan. So if you have an $800,000 plan, well, then you need $800,000 worth of ERISA bond coverage, so that if something does happen, so whether an allegation of mismanagement or something like that comes in, that is those funds will be replaced. And then fiduciary liability, if there is an allegation that someone is, not acting in their capacity as a fiduciary in the best interest of the employees or the plan members, and they sue the organization because of it, that is what fiduciary liability provides a defense for. And then there's also, in addition to these two, employee benefit liability. If you do have an employee benefit plan, you get a new employee and you just get bogged down in, the many hats you wear as a nonprofit leader, and you forget to add them to the plan within that specified time window, and then they turn around and sue you because of it, that's what employee benefit liability provides a defense for. Now, umbrellas and excess liability, really not much unique about these. Still worth talking about, because generally we see insurance policies that have a $1 million or a $1 million per occurrence limit with a $2 million general aggregate, meaning that the most the carrier pays for any one claim in the policy period is $1 million. The most they'll pay for all claims in the policy period is $2 million, all claims aggregated. And, there are some organizations out there with, have big operations, lots of clients, big fleets of automobiles, things like that, where those limits may not be sufficient. So you can buy an umbrella policy, or in the commercial insurance industry, we refer to it more as excess liability. That's really a safety net, so that if you exhaust the limits on your underlying policies, then your excess liability policy kicks in. And most policies can be covered by an umbrella policy, with the exception of directors and officers liability, cyber liability, employment practices liability, and fiduciary liability. And it's not going to provide excess coverage for your property, because generally the insurance carriers have a clause on the property policies that say, if you're not insuring this building to 90% of its reconstruction costs, well, we're going to ding you. So you can't buy an excess policy to prevent that from happening. It's just really designed to help protect nonprofits from catastrophic claims. Now we'll talk about insurance carriers and agents. I'm an insurance agent. They call me an insurance agent because I'm an agent of the carriers that I represent. I'm independent, meaning I represent a number of insurance carriers, and I act on their behalf, meaning I negotiate on their behalf, I sell on their behalf, I collect information on their behalf. But really, I collect the information from my prospects or my clients, send it off to the insurance carrier. They determine what the rates are. And when it comes back to me, if I don't like the rates, I can try to argue with them or negotiate with them to try to get your rates lowered. But that's really the relationship between myself as an agent and the insurance carrier. And just like not all insurance agents are proficient or experienced in working with nonprofits, not all insurance carriers are experienced or even willing to insure nonprofits. And so there's some people out there who they may have an insurance policy with an insurance carrier, and the insurance carrier may not be fully aware that you're a nonprofit organization. And it's not necessarily that voids coverage, but on most insurance policies written by carriers that don't work with nonprofits, if a volunteer causes a general liability claim, so a volunteer causes bodily injury or property damage, it may be excluded. And so it's really critical that you work with your agent to make sure that you're represented by an agent that is proficient and experienced in working with nonprofits, but also that you're insured by an insurance carrier that doesn't have weird carve-outs and exclusions and things like that really don't adequately cover your operations. And that's why it's really important to vet and choose your agents with precision. Ask them how many nonprofits they serve. Serving on a board of directors is great, but it doesn't necessarily mean that insurance agent has experience insuring nonprofits or access to carriers that work with nonprofits, because as independent insurance agents, I don't necessarily have carte blanche access to every insurance carrier under the sun. There are contracts in place and things like that. And so, just ask some questions of your agent to make sure that you have the best representation possible. And it's, if they have access to one carrier, I guess it helps in some sense, but you want to see that they have access to a few different carriers that they can get quotes from, because the insurance market, it is constantly changing. Even before COVID, we were going into what's called a hard market in the insurance industry, meaning carriers hadn't been profitable, so they were going to raise their rates regardless of if you had claims or not. Put a lot of nonprofit organizations in a bad position, because you may never have had a claim before, but your rate maybe went up 10, 20, some cases 100%, just because carriers, need to be profitable. They're businesses when it comes down to it. And if they're not profitable, they're going to take steps necessary to become profitable. And so if you're working with an agent that doesn't have a variety of carriers to approach, you could get pigeonholed into eating that 100% increase or 50% increase, as opposed to working with an independent agent who does have access to multiple carriers that work with nonprofits. We can shop around, we can, pull your no claim history and sell you to the insurance carrier on why you deserve the lowest rate possible. And so now that we've gone over, really the 101 level of nonprofit insurance, what comes next? And insurance is just one piece of nonprofit risk management. Oftentimes people intertwine the terms insurance and risk management, where the reality is that risk management is a much bigger function than just buying insurance. Insurance is just one small piece of that puzzle. There's processes like loss control, policies and procedures, safety manuals, screening processes and procedures. There's a lot of different variables that go into risk management for nonprofit organizations specifically, and you each have, unique needs and challenges for mitigating risk. And so really, most nonprofits, you don't have the luxury of an in-house risk manager, someone not only with a deep knowledge of insurance, but a deep knowledge of what you can do to understand the risk that you are facing, measure that risk, mitigate that risk, and ultimately lower the total cost of risk for the organization, because it impacts everything. It could be that you have a bad claim year, so then you have to, go through the process of retraining employees, implementing safety procedures, and it all costs money. It all adds up. It may not seem like much individually, but when you take a step back and look at the entire picture, the amount of money spent on the organization as it relates to managing and mitigating risk, it all contributes to the total cost of risk. And so a question I have for you all is, would you like to learn more about risk management? And if not, what other topics related to insurance or risk management are you interested in? Because I come from Idaho. We have a really great relationship with the Idaho Nonprofit Center. We're regularly providing these kinds of webinars, but also much more specific webinars and instruction and things like that, we obviously are in the business of getting more clients, but we know that in instances like this, I'm here to provide value to you as a member of the Montana Nonprofit Association, not to sell you something. So regardless of if you could become my client or not, I want to do more stuff like this. I want to give you the information you need, not only to make smart insurance buying decisions, but also to help you develop a risk management plan so that you can focus more on carrying out the organization's mission than dealing with claims and things like that. So if you have any questions or you want to learn more about risk management, want to see a presentation like that, go ahead, throw it in the chat box. I don't know if any questions came in during the webinar, but there was one question in the registration, and that was about bonding for nonprofits. And so in addition to the ERISA bond, there are what's called fiduciary bonds available, and what those their main function is to cover the cash on hand or cash in reserves for nonprofit organizations against things like embezzlement, employee theft, and things like that. So it is possible. Generally, if you have certain controls in place, it's not that expensive to bond funds. And when I say controls, I mean, do you have two signers on the company checkbook? How many people have access to the bank account and things like that? And so bonding, it absolutely is available for nonprofits, and it's relatively inexpensive.
Great, thank you, Drew. And we do have a few questions. So I'll just, do one at a time for you, and you can get as specific as you need. But the first question was, what can you tell us about insurance for museums to cover artwork and collection, exhibitions, and to and from transit?
That's a great question. It gets complex when we're talking about museums and your artifacts or your artwork. Generally, the only option available is to schedule that onto either what's called an inland marine policy, if it is equipment that is regularly traveling between different locations, and it's called inland marine because it is traveling. Ocean marine covers cargo while it goes from one port to another. Inland marine covers property. while it's in transit or stored. But whereas a traditional property policy, your desks, your computers, even at your house, things like your refrigerator, your appliances, things like that, it's really tied to that specific location. And so I guess the best way I can answer that is, get an Excel spreadsheet together, list all of the artifacts, all of the, valuable property you want insured, with a description of what it is and its value. And then, depending on whether or not it regularly moves between locations, or even if it's stationary at one location, it's probably going to end up on what's called an in the marine policy.
Great, thank you. And so the next question is sort of just like a little bit of an offshoot of the hired auto one. Is there anything to think about with covering volunteer drivers for vehicles owned by a nonprofit?
Not necessarily. A lot of the insurance carriers we work with, they're pushing to have, nonprofits do order what's called MVR reports for every single driver. We know that that's not really feasible from a financial perspective, because especially, not only do nonprofits, deal with more turnover than your average business, but you also, with volunteers, they may come once, they may come regularly. You may have a big base of volunteers that you're working with, and the MVRs are about $6 a piece. But as far as what you can do to make sure that your volunteers who are driving your owned vehicles are covered, is just on an annual basis, or if it changes throughout the year. Again, I like spreadsheets because they're easy to manipulate, they're easy to edit. Create a driver list that includes their full name, date of birth, and driver's license number. And as changes happen to it, you could send it to your agent just to say, here's our driver list. We added this driver, we removed this driver. That is something that we do recommend. That way, the carrier can't come back and say, well, they're not a covered driver. And generally, and another thing too is to ask and document their answer. Ask the volunteer if they have any incidents in the last 7 years, including DUIs or anything like that. And if they say no, document it. But chances are the carrier itself may run an MVR. And if it does come back that person does have a DUI or a bad driving history, they may outright say that, we will not cover that person. They're an excluded driver from the policy.
Great. And so the next question is, how specific does a professional liability policy need to be? For example, if an economic development organization employee gives business advice to a business owner and that business fails, should there be protection for the organization?
The short answer is yes. The more complex answer is that a lot of these claims are taken on a case-by-case basis. And if you are worried that, like an economic, like a chamber of commerce type organization, if you're coaching a business or helping a business out, and then they turn around and sue you for a financial loss, or say that the information you gave them wasn't adequate or was incorrect, that is exactly what a professional liability policy in most cases would cover. But it's hard to speak in a generalistic way about every single professional liability policy, because each carrier is different, each policy is different, each one is going to exclude different things. And that's why another great question to ask your insurance agents that'll really catch them off guard, because we don't get asked this very often, but is, what's excluded? What's not covered on my policy? And if they, I don't know it off the top of my head. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that if they don't have an answer for you instantly, you should fire them. But, the more detailed of an answer they give you, the more comfortable you should be with that answer. I personally like to take the time to read through the forms and the endorsements and the exclusions on insurance policies, because I know that if I go out and I sell someone a policy, I tell them something is covered and it's not, that's a professional liability claim on myself. I'm going to get sued because of that. And so that's, it's a really great question to ask your agents, what's excluded, because there could be the case that you have a professional liability policy in place that only covers licensed professionals, as opposed to just providing professional services. And so, on one hand, it's good to have the professional liability policy, but on the other, you want to make sure it's the right one.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we have a question about general liability. So you mentioned that the policy sort of follows you around, but this organization, they're constantly asked to name additional insured when they're putting on events or hanging lamppost banners. And so she's wondering if they're doing a pint night event and they don't specifically name that brewery as an additional insured, does that mean they're not covered there, or how do you handle that?
That's a great question. An additional insured request is generally coming from, so a good example I have is I'm actually working with a prospect right now who's going to be running a summer camp at a city park in Bozeman. The city of Bozeman wants this nonprofit to name them as an additional insured. And it's not necessarily because the nonprofit wants coverage at that park. It's more so that if the park gets sued because a participant of that camp hurts themselves there, the park's insurance isn't going to respond to it. There'll be an additional insured on the nonprofit's insurance policy. And that it's a really tricky way, and it's more and more common as people get more informed with risk management, that if you go to a brewery and they're not listed as an additional insured, it doesn't necessarily mean that you as the entity aren't covered for claims that happen there. It just means that if someone sues the brewery, that additional insured isn't in place, so their policy is going to respond to it as opposed to the nonprofit's insurance policy. And if that wasn't clear enough, if you want me to go more in depth, please feel free to speak up and I'll clarify.
Great. So Annie, let us know if you need clarification. But the last question that I've got in chat right now is that we're an organization that does a lot of on the water activities like multi-day flat water canoe trips, along with regular backcountry field work. Is it difficult to find insurance to cover water activities, or is there any advice for getting that covered? And we have gotten a few questions from our outdoors recreation organizations.
Yeah.
We work in multiple states, we do rappelling off mountains. How do we get covered? And
yeah, it's more difficult, and unfortunately it's more expensive. I'm actually working with a guy right now who is out of northern Idaho providing sailing experiences to underserved populations, and it was incredibly hard to find insurance for him. And it's just because activities of that nature, there's so much higher of a risk of injury and something going wrong than in a nonprofit that's like a food bank, and you're tied to a location. You may serve a large community and have a lot of food going out, but the chance of a catastrophic claim when you're doing a multi-day canoeing trip, or you're a day in the backcountry, that claim can get out of control quickly. And so it's not impossible. It's certainly something that we have experience with, and it's actually similar. We usually approach the same carriers that we have our hunters and outfitters and guiders with, mountaineers, mountain climbers and stuff like that, who are guiding people in those activities. Those are the same types of carriers that we would put a nonprofit providing those similar services with. It's just a tricky position to be in, because a lot of times those carriers, they don't offer professional liability. They don't offer improper sexual conduct liability. They're much more limited when it comes to the types of insurance that do specifically apply to nonprofits. It's not to say it's impossible, but we do have a little bit of a harder time, obtaining those other coverages if they're necessary, and it can get more expensive, and the risk management involved with something like that is a little more comprehensive, but it's certainly possible.
Great. And we just had a follow-up from Annie about the liability. So she just wondering, why would our landlord require us to name them as an additional insured if our general liability already covers this space?
So even if your general liability covers the space, like I mentioned before, insurance carriers are in the business of making money. And if they can weasel their way out of paying your landlord for damage to the building itself, they'll find a way to do it. So if you name the landlord as an additional insured on your policy, it really guarantees your landlord that if you damage their property during your occupancy, it's your insurance that's going to pay for that. Without naming them as an additional insured, I can't necessarily say that your insurance carrier would outright refuse to do it. It might just be harder to do that. And one thing to keep in mind that is generally a little more unique to nonprofits is that if you're with an insurance carrier that specializes in nonprofits, if the additional insured request is in the form of a contract, which can be as simple as an email saying you need to list us as an additional insured, there's generally no charge to add additional insureds to the policy. Whereas if you are a for-profit business, a contractor working with a number of general contractors, they often have to pay a fee to add additional insureds to their policies. And so that if you have been paying for additional insureds previously, talk to your agent and ask them, do you need to see a copy of the contract? How can we get around paying this?
Great. That is good advice. And then we have a question about the liquor liability and the pint night one-time events. So do you need to add the brewery to your policy for a one-time event, or does the liquor liability cover like those one night events as well as your annual fundraiser? Or do you just need to be good about adding each specific additional insured type place?
It really depends on a number of factors. If you have liquor liability on your policy, you're not required to add the brewery as an additional insured on the policy. However, it's a good practice to give your insurance agent information about the events that you're having to make sure the insurance carrier is aware of them and there's not some exclusion on the policy that excludes that activity. But generally speaking, you don't necessarily need to add every single venue that you have in a fundraiser at as an additional insured. The only caveat to that is that a lot of venues now, they are requiring that you add them as an additional insured. And so really the quick answer here is that, unless you're required to add them, no, you don't have to, but more and more people are requiring it. So it is good to, especially if you have annualized events, you just give the information to the insurance agent every year at renewal or when you're setting the policy up to make sure that event is covered and whether or not there's additional premium to make sure it's covered and things like that.
Great, thank you. Does anyone else have a question? If so, put it into chat now. Otherwise, I would just say, Drew, thank you so much for this. It's been enlightening. And like I said, we get a ton of questions about insurance, and we at MNA are not nearly qualified to answer any of them, basically. So I appreciate you sharing this information with us and for being so willing to just share information and, support risk management practices and strategies and things like that. So everyone, I will say, think about risk management, what you want to learn. Feel free to just email me, if you're interested, even if you don't know what you want to learn, shoot me an email, let me know, and we can definitely get more webinars like this on the books, because I do think this information is super valuable. So thank you so much. And thanks, Drew, for being here. We will send out a recording. And Drew, do you mind if we send out the PowerPoint? Someone asked if they could have it. So
of course. Yeah, of course.
I think they're planning to grill their insurance agent about all the specific things on the PowerPoint. So
go for it.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you all. I hope you have a good afternoon and a great weekend. And let me know if you do have any questions. Feel free to shoot me an email, everyone. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, everyone, for your time. I really appreciate it and look forward to being part of the Montana nonprofit community.
Great. Thanks, Drew.